Hello and welcome to the Macedon Rangers Uniting Church Partnership. This week it's just me, so welcome and let's chat. We have a couple of readings this week, one from the start of Samuel. Israel's seen a period of unrest and violence, and Israel's not really functioning that well. It's scattered little clans really, and life's pretty tough. And we hear the story of Hannah. Hannah's married, but she's not the only wife, and she's not been able to have children. And the other wife has had plenty of children, but Hannah is the favoured wife, and Penina, the other wife, she's really jealous. She's so jealous and hurt and unloved that she feels spiteful towards Hannah and gives her a really harsh time. So much so that Hannah just cannot bear it anymore. We've probably all felt we've had times where we just cannot bear where we're at anymore. And we might try talking to the people around us, like Hannah tried to talk to her husband, and he wasn't that helpful, was he? He said, "Oh, but aren't I better than 10 sons?" And put it onto himself rather than empathising with Hannah and trying to go about finding a solution, which might have been to actually show Penina some love. So, yeah, trying to chat with her husband didn't really help Hannah, and so she turned to God. And that is what we all can do. We can turn to God. In fact, we can turn to God even before we get to a point where we cannot tolerate things anymore. There's a terrific hymn by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I'll read that to you. All go to God when they are sorely placed. They plead to God for help, for peace, for bread, for mercy, for them sinning, sick or dead. We all do so in faith or unbelief. We go to God when God is sorely placed. Find God poor, scorned, unsheltered, without bread, whelmed under weight of evil, weak or dead. We stand by God then, in God's hour of grief. God comes to us when we are sorely placed. Body and spirit feeds us with God's bread. For everyone, he as a man hangs dead, for given life, he gives all through his death. Quite a powerful hymn. And if you're at Gisborne this Sunday, you might even sing it. But what do we do when things are really rubbish and we cannot bear it any longer? What's God going to do? We wait for a response, don't we? We wait for some creative insight or impulse. We wait for some guidance as to what step to take next. Certainly for me, in a marriage where I was really struggling, I talked to friends and counsellor, spiritual director, but really it was in spending time with God that the creative solutions became clear and a pathway forward was found. It's a blessing when we thought we were in a really stuck place and then a way forward happens. In Hannah's story, it's a story told about how Israel came to have a king. It's the start of that story. And we hear that God blesses Hannah with a son. And she felt vindicated. It doesn't really help with what might have happened to Penina. It's actually Penina needed some loving too, didn't she? And yeah, if we spend time with God, we can be encouraged to be generous and to share God's love as God would love us. Anyway, Hannah does have a son, and the scripture then tells us that Hannah sings a song of praise to God. And we all come to church on a Sunday and we gather and we sing praises to God too for all that God has done for us. The correct response to God's generosity and love is to offer our praise and thanks. And we have that opportunity to do that. But when we come to Mark's Gospel, we've got a picture of Israel that's occupied, and Israel seems to have lost its way. The tribes are scattered. The temple seems to have become more of a business than a place of spiritual nourishment and well-being. And the sentiment of the day, as I understand it, was that eventually God will send a new king from David's line that will set things right. Everything will be as it ought to be. And then when that happens, that is a sign that all of Israel is forgiven, all their sins, all their iniquities, and that everything would be put to right. And then we have Jesus, and Jesus understands himself as that Messiah, and we see that in Mark's Gospel, and we've heard, Peter say, "You are the Messiah," and we've had the blind man say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." The blind man can see that Jesus is the one of God who is compassionate and loving and draws him into community. So we have this sense in Mark's Gospel, there's this immediacy. Immediately, he says this immediately, a lot. And that this apocalyptic vision of God setting all things right is going to happen quickly and immediately. But then we hear of Jesus' death. And what? That wasn't how things were supposed to be. Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey, not on a stallion like a proper king. And he ends up on a cross where the worst of the worst, the really rotten people, they're the ones that end up on the cross. So the community had to try and make sense of all of this. What happened to the king that was going to set things right? And then they saw him in the resurrection, and they were able to eat with him and engage with him and share bread with him. And Jesus speaks of God's love being beyond death and God's mercy being beyond the powers of corruption and sin and the reach of jealousy and all the things that cause us pain and grief. And we get this sense that God's victory over death is the victory of God who loves us even when we're not so loving ourselves. So where does that leave us for today? It leaves us with the sense that in this time of seeming chaos in our world, people are wondering about how much carbon emissions is too much, what we need to be doing. Do we eat less meat, drive less, ride our bikes more? Do we find new technologies that don't produce so much carbon? Do we use less plastics? It seems like our world is really in a fair bit of strife. And what is God doing? Probably the question ought to be, what are we doing? I think the invitation today is we are being called to God. Spend time with God. Be guided by God's wisdom and find new ways of being God's children, new ways of being God's community, new ways of being with one another in community in God's love. So Jesus is the foundation of our church, and Jesus calls us to love one another and to love our neighbour as ourselves. And let's just keep doing that, as I know we have all been doing. Bless you all, and look forward to speaking again next week. Cheerio.